It is December 6th, 1969. A helicopter beats its way through the hazy California sky, descending toward a teeming, chaotic mass of humanity. Inside, Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, the biggest, baddest rock and roll band in the world, looks down. Just 4 months earlier, a similar scene had played out over a farm in upstate New York. That event, Woodstock, had become a symbol of a generation's peaceful, utopian dream. 500,000 young people had gathered in mud and rain and proved to a watching world that they could create a new, gentle society. This was meant to be the glorious second act. This was Woodstock West, a free concert, a triumphant celebratory end to the Stones' blockbuster 1969 American tour. But as the helicopter gets closer, the scene below does not look peaceful. It doesn't look like a pastoral gathering. It looks like a wound. The helicopter lands and the band is immediately swarmed. An aggressive, chaotic energy boils around them. As Mick Jagger steps out, a man in the crowd, his face contorted, lunges and punches him in the side of the head, shouting, "I hate you!" before being dragged away. Jagger, stunned, stumbles, but is hurried forward. This is the very first moment. The star of the show has been on the ground for less than a minute, and he has already been attacked. This was the Altamont Speedway Free Festival. It was not the 60s' greatest party. It was its brutal, bloody, and inevitable funeral. It was the day the peace and love generation was forced to look at its own dark, violent reflection, and the image that stared back was terrifying. This is the story of that day, the day the dream didn't just fade away. It was murdered in cold blood, all while the cameras were rolling. This was not just a bad concert, a disastrously planned event. It was an inevitability. It was the moment the dark, nihilistic, and self-destructive undercurrent of the 1960s, a current that had been ignored, romanticized, or hidden beneath flowers, finally, violently asserted itself. The counterculture, high on its own myth of invincibility, had invited its own shadow to the party. On this day, the shadow devoured the light. This is the story of how that happened, moment by moment. To understand the arrogance of Altamont, you must first understand the miracle of Woodstock. The year 1969 was one of profound contradictions. In July, humanity had achieved the impossible, a technological miracle of the highest order. We had landed on the moon. It was an act of profound organization, discipline, and scientific optimism. Just 1 month later, in August, the counterculture had its own moon landing. 500,000 people descended on Max Yasgur's farm in upstate New York. By every logistical measure, it should have been a catastrophe. The New York State Thruway was shut down. The fences were torn down on the first day, forcing the organizers to declare it a free concert, not by choice, but by necessity. There was not enough food, not enough water, not enough sanitation. Then, the skies opened, and a torrential downpour turned the entire place into a sea of mud. And yet, it wasn't a catastrophe. It became a symbol of something new, a new form of human society. The crowd policed itself. People shared their food, they took care of each other. The hippie ideal, the belief in communalism and peace, was put to the ultimate test, and it passed. The world saw it and was astonished. Even the National Guard, when they arrived to airlift food and medical supplies, were not seen as the enemy, but as helpers. The music itself was largely folk rock, psychedelic rock, and soul, music that even at its loudest, like Jimi Hendrix's searing Star-Spangled Banner, was rooted in a message of community or exploration. Woodstock was more than a concert. It was a media event. The subsequent film and album, released in 1970, crafted a powerful, curated narrative. The world saw beautiful, rain-soaked people sharing food, smiling, and listening to transcendent music from artists like Santana, Jimi Hendrix, and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. What they didn't see as much was the bad acid, the logistical nightmare, or the sheer dumb luck involved. They didn't see the 2 people who actually died at Woodstock, one from an overdose, another run over by a tractor. Those inconvenient truths were edited out of the myth. The event was canonized as a miracle, a spontaneous, peaceful city. And this myth created a dangerous blueprint. It created a sense of invincibility. It made the entire generation feel as though peace and love were not fragile ideals to be carefully nurtured, but an automatic, magical force that would simply triumph over any obstacle, in any location, with any crowd. This was the first ingredient in the Altamont disaster: hubris. Now, enter the Rolling Stones. The Stones were not Woodstock. They were not Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young singing about golden hippies. They were, and had always been, the anti-Beatles. The Beatles, even in their long-haired psychedelic phase, were ultimately lovable. They sang "All You Need Is Love." The Rolling Stones sang "Street Fighting Man." They were the bad boys, the sneering, sexual, dangerous alternative. They had cultivated an image of chaos, of flirting with the darkness. After their own brief failed experiment with flower power on the 1967 album Their Satanic Majesty's Request, they had run screaming back to their roots. Their 1968 album, Beggar's Banquet, was a masterpiece of raw, acoustic, blues-based menace. It opened with "Sympathy for the Devil," a song in which Mick Jagger himself is Lucifer, narrating his role in human atrocities with a detached, seductive glee. This wasn't just a song, it was a persona, and Jagger was leaning into it. And as 1969 came to a close, their new album, Let It Bleed, was about to be released. This album was even darker. It opened with "Gimme Shelter," an apocalyptic howl about war and violence being just a shot away. It featured "Midnight Rambler," a terrifying 9-minute blues operetta about a serial killer. The album's final ironic statement was, "You can't always get what you want." This was the music the Rolling Stones were bringing to America. They weren't just flirting with the darkness, they were its house band. Their 1969 American tour, their first in 3 years, was a commercial juggernaut. It was also a pivotal moment for the band. Their original leader and founder, Brian Jones, had descended into a haze of substance abuse and been fired from the band in June. Less than a month later, he was found dead in his swimming pool, a tragic, sordid end that only added to the band's dark mythology. The band, with their brilliant new 20-year-old guitarist Mick Taylor, had forged ahead. Taylor's arrival had changed their sound, making it more muscular, more guitar-heavy, more aggressive. This new, powerful twin guitar sound with Keith Richards is what they were bringing to America. This tour was, in part, a reintroduction, a declaration that the Stones were back, reborn, and more powerful than ever. They were, for the first time, billing themselves publicly as the greatest rock and roll band in the world. This was a title they had to live up to, and it added to the pressure. The tour was also dogged by controversy. This tour essentially invented modern stadium rock pricing. Ticket prices were, by the standards of the day, astronomically high, with top seats going for $7 or $8. This may seem laughably cheap now, but at the time it was 2 or 3 times what other top acts were charging. This led to protests and scathing articles in the underground press, including the Village Voice. The People's Band was being accused of being greedy, of being detached from the very counterculture that championed them. A Rolling Stone magazine review of their Madison Square Garden show was titled, "How to Make $1 Million." At a press conference, a reporter aggressively challenged Jagger, "How much did you make?" This criticism stung. The free concert was, in part, an act of public relations, a massive grand gesture to prove they were still connected to the street and to say thank you to America. This is where the second ingredient of the disaster, desperation, entered the mix. The concert was announced with almost no preparation. The idea was to have it in San Francisco, the spiritual home of the hippie movement. The initial logical plan was to hold it in Golden Gate Park. That fell through due to permits and city bureaucracy. The second plan was Sears Point Raceway, a professional racetrack. This seemed perfect. The contracts were being drawn up, the stage was being built, but at the last minute, literally 72 hours before the show, The deal collapsed. The raceway's owners, Filmways Inc., got wind of the fact that the film Gimme Shelter was being made by the Maysles brothers, and they demanded a cut of the profits and a $100,000 bond. The deal was off. Panic set in. 300,000 people were already on their way, a rolling mass of humanity converging on the Bay Area. The concert had been announced. It had to happen. A frantic, desperate search for a new location began, involving legendary promoter Bill Graham, lawyer Melvin Belly, and various counterculture figures. At the 11th hour, a man named Dick Carter offered up his failing, dilapidated speedway, Altamont. Altamont Speedway was not a pastoral farm. It was not a grassy park. It was a desolate, ugly concrete bowl in a barren stretch of hills between Tracy and Livermore, California. It wasn't just imperfect. It was a hostile environment. It was a barren, treeless, windswept bowl. The ground was littered with broken glass and old car parts. To get to the concert area, attendees had to abandon their cars and slide down steep, dusty embankments. The temperature, as afternoon wore on, began to plummet. There were no medical facilities to speak of, save for a few tents staffed by volunteers. There was no running water. There were only a handful of portable toilets for a crowd that would swell to over 300,000. It was the absolute worst possible place for a massive, uncontrolled gathering. But in the desperation of the final 72 hours, it was the only place. In a mad dash, the stage crew tore down the scaffolding at Sears Point and raced 50 miles east to Altamont to rebuild it in the dark. And then came the fatal decision, the decision that would seal Altamont's doom. They needed security. But why the Hells Angels? To the 1969 counterculture, the Angels, like the rock stars themselves, were symbols of freedom. They were seen as romantic outlaws, rejecting the straight world of 9-to-5 jobs in suburban conformity. Figures like Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters had partied with them, romanticizing them as fellow travelers, as American individualists. The Grateful Dead, in particular, saw them as part of the San Francisco outlaw family and had used them for security at their free concerts in Golden Gate Park. In that context, a grassy park, a familiar crowd, a more relaxed vibe, it had mostly worked. This was a profound, naive, and catastrophic misunderstanding of what the Angels actually were. This wasn't just naivete, it was willful ignorance. The romantic image, popularized by people like Ken Kesey, coexisted with a very public, known reputation for brutality and racial animus. Hunter S. Thompson's book, Hell's Angels, The Strange and Terrible Saga of the Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs, published in 1966, was not a celebration. It was a harrowing warning, detailing their viciousness and rigid, violent code. He described them as thugs who would stomp anyone for a perceived slight. The counterculture, especially Kesey and the Dead, chose to see them as noble savages or outlaw brothers, a rebellious force that could be charmed by good vibes and music. They believed their own mythology. The Grateful Dead's manager, Rock Scully, and others suggested them. The Stones team, led by their tour manager Sam Cutler, sealed the deal. The infamous payment? $500 worth of beer. Let's pause and consider the sheer, staggering arrogance of this decision. This wasn't security. This was an invitation for chaos. They were not hiring a police force. In fact, the anti-establishment counterculture hated the police, the pigs. The police were the enemy. So who else could protect the stage? This decision was a direct result of the counterculture's anti-establishment paranoia. They chose the devils they knew over the authorities they despised. They weren't hiring security. They were paying a gang to party on the stage. The day began. December 6th, 1969. The crowd poured in, far more than anyone expected. There was no order, no infrastructure. The vibe was wrong from the first minute. The air was not filled with peace and marijuana. It was filled with cheap red wine and a powerful low-grade bad batch of LSD that was making the crowd agitated and unpredictable. A wave of brown acid was reportedly circulating, causing paranoia and aggression rather than euphoria. The stage itself was a disaster. It had been built in a desperate hurry. It was barely 3 feet high, set at the bottom of a slope. This meant the crowd wasn't in front of the stage. They were on top of it, pressing in from all sides, crushing against it. This was a critical failure. At Woodstock, the stage was high, creating a natural barrier. At Altamont, the performers were, for all practical purposes, in the audience. The Angels, full of beer and a sense of absolute ownership, parked their motorcycles in front of the stage, creating a wall of chrome. They took it upon themselves to secure this tiny, low island by any means necessary. And their means were brutal. Anyone who touched a bike, anyone who pushed too hard, anyone who looked at them the wrong way, was met with fists, weighted pool cues, and iron crosses. The music started. Santana, one of the heroes of Woodstock, played a brilliant, frantic set. Carlos Santana's soaring guitar was a desperate attempt to create a positive, percussive vibe to levitate the crowd above the ugliness. But you could already see the tension. The Gimme Shelter footage shows the Angels starting their brutal security work during the day's first act. A man, naked and disoriented, is set upon by several Angels and beaten to the ground. This is happening in broad daylight before the headliners even arrive. The next act was the Flying Burrito Brothers. Graham Parsons, a man who understood the dark side of American culture, was reportedly so terrified by the ugly, mean vibe that he was in tears, and the band played a short, nervous set and got out as fast as they could. Then came the true turning point. The moment the day's fate was sealed, Jefferson Airplane, the royalty of the San Francisco Sound, took the stage. The violence was now constant. The Angels were a brutal, drunken mob, pulling people off speaker towers, beating them. "Stop hurting people," Grace Slick pleaded, her voice a mix of hippie optimism and growing fear. "People, it's not, we're not, just be cool." Then, lead singer Marty Balin, seeing a man in the crowd being viciously beaten by an Angel, did what he was supposed to do. He jumped off the stage to intervene. He put his hand on the Angel's shoulder. The Angel turned and, without a word, knocked Balin unconscious. This was the moment. The star on his own stage was laid out cold by the security. Paul Kantner, the band's guitarist, grabbed a microphone and directly confronted the assailants. "Hey, man," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I'd like to mention that the Hells Angels just smashed Marty Balin in the face." An Angel seized a microphone, shoved him, and snarled back, "You're talking to me?" The band played on, terrified, but the spell was broken. The performers were no longer in control. They were hostages. This brings us to the next critical narrative beat, the Grateful Dead's arrival. The Dead were, in many ways, the spiritual hosts of the San Francisco scene. They were the ones who had the relationship with the Angels. They were supposed to be a unifying force, the band that could bring the vibe back. They arrived at the Speedway. They saw the chaos. They saw the violence. They saw the beaten, terrified, and intoxicated crowd. They saw the Angels, now a full-blown drunken army, in total control of the stage. And Jerry Garcia, the band's leader, made a decision. He looked at the scene and he said, "We're not playing." This was a massive verdict. The godfathers of the scene, the ones who had legitimized the Angels in the first place, looked at the party they helped create and noped out. It was too far gone. They recognized a bad situation when they saw one. This act of self-preservation, however, left a gaping vacuum. The crowd, which had been waiting all day, grew angrier, more restless. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young followed, taking the stage in the freezing twilight. The vibe was so terrifying that Stephen Stills was reportedly struck in the leg with a sharpened pool cue. David Crosby later was blunt. The music was no good. The vibe was no good. It was just a black, terrible day. They got through their songs, including a tense version of Down by the River, a song, ironically, about a murder, and fled the stage, desperate to get their helicopter out before total darkness fell. Now, it was completely dark. The crowd of 300,000 was a single writhing, ugly mass, freezing cold, fueled by bad substances, and furious. All the peace and love acts had either been beaten or had run away. There was only one band left. The Rolling Stones had to play. It was their show. They were the headliners. They were the only ones who could possibly cap this disaster. They had waited until it was fully dark, partly for the dramatic effect of their film lights, partly because, like everyone else, they were terrified. They finally made their way to the stage, a phalanx of angels surrounding them. The energy was electric, but it was the energy of a riot. Jagger, in his black and red Omega symbol shirt, looked like the Satan from his own song, the master of ceremonies for this dark ritual. They opened. The chaos was immediate. They tried to start Sympathy for the Devil, a song that in this context was not a clever metaphor, but a direct invitation. The crowd surged. Fights broke out everywhere. The angels responded by wading into the audience, swinging pool cues, cracking heads. The band, clearly terrified, stopped and started. Jagger, his voice no longer the arrogant rock god, but a small, pleading human voice, spoke into the microphone. "Brothers and sisters, come on now. Cool out. Everybody just cool out. Who's fighting and what for? What's going on?" He sounds small, powerless, a man who had lit a fuse and was now begging the bomb not to explode. Keith Richards, more angrily, can be heard on the recordings, "Either those cats cool it, man, or we don't play." But they had to play. They were trapped. They pivoted, moving into Under My Thumb, another song of sexual dominance that took on a sinister new meaning in this atmosphere of brute force. And this is the moment. Meredith Hunter, an 18-year-old black man, was in the crowd. He was with his white girlfriend, Patty Bredehoft. He was agitated, reportedly high, and trying to get onto the stage. He was pushed back violently by the angels. He returned angry. He was wearing a bright lime green suit, a starkly visible figure in the darkness. He pulled a long-barreled .22 caliber revolver from his jacket. A Hell's Angel named Alan Pissarro, standing on the edge of the stage, saw the glint of the gun. He lunged. He grabbed Hunter's wrist with one hand and with the other plunged a knife into his neck. He stabbed him again in the back. Hunter stumbled, and the crowd like an ocean swallowed him up. He was stabbed multiple times, then kicked and beaten on the ground by several angels, all while the band, bathed in the red and white lights of the film crew, played on. They were oblivious, separated by a wall of noise, light, and their own security. They finished Under My Thumb. They played Brown Sugar. They played Midnight Rambler. They were playing for their lives, a desperate, frantic set, trying to get through it and escape. The show finally ended. The Stones were rushed back to the helicopter, their faces grim, and took off, lifting up and away from the chaos, leaving 300,000 people in the dark, cold, violent wreckage of their party. The immediate aftermath was a grim accounting. 4 people were dead. Meredith Hunter murdered, 2 others killed in a hit-and-run car accident in the traffic jam, 1 a man who had drowned in an irrigation ditch, likely high. The media, which just 4 months ago had celebrated the utopian promise of Woodstock, now had its dark counter-narrative. The headlines were brutal, but the definitive epitaph was written by Rolling Stone magazine, the very voice of the counterculture. In a scathing 10,000-word special report titled "The Rolling Stones' Disaster at Altamont, Let It Bleed," they methodically dissected the arrogance, the greed, and the catastrophic naivete that led to the event. The article concluded, famously, Altamont was the end of the 60s. But the final damning verdict came from the Gimme Shelter documentary. The Maysles brothers footage, which they had been shooting all day, was the objective, grim witness. The most chilling scene in all of rock and roll history is not on a stage. It's in an editing bay. The Stones, weeks later, are shown the footage. Mick Jagger, his face a mask of youthful confidence, watches as the editor freezes the film, zooms in, and shows him, frame by frame, the glint of Meredith Hunter's gun, the lunge of Pissarro, the blade. Jagger's face, in that moment, freezes. The mask cracks. The arrogance evaporates. He's just a 26-year-old man, watching a murder that he helped stage. He stares, mute, as the editor rewinds and plays it again. The dream dies on camera for him and for the entire world. The legal aftermath only added to the darkness. Alan Pissarro was arrested and charged with Meredith Hunter's murder. He went to trial. The Gimme Shelter footage was the key piece of evidence, and the jury, after viewing the footage that clearly showed Hunter holding a gun, acquitted Pissarro in just a few hours. Justifiable homicide. The violence was, in a twisted legal sense, justified. The system, in the end, sided with the angels. The counterculture's anti-establishment heroes had become the establishment's excused agents. This was the final bitter irony. Why did Altamont fail? It wasn't just the Hells Angels, though they were the instruments of the violence. It was the hubris. It was the naive belief that peace and love was an automatic force, a magical spell that would pacify even a violent biker gang. It was the toxic, volatile mix of a terrible, indefensible location, a crowd unmoored by bad substances, and the Stones' own dark, satanic Majesty's image, which had attracted a different, more volatile energy than the folk rock of Woodstock. The legacy of Altamont is absolute. It was the definitive bloody bookend to the 1960s. Woodstock was the dream. Altamont was the hangover. It was the end of an era of collective innocence and the beginning of the cynical, jaded, introspective 1970s. The age of Aquarius gave way to the me decade. The dream of a utopian counterculture was dead, killed on a desolate speedway by the very people it had naively invited to the party. The stories of the 1960s and 70s are full of these moments, these myths, and the dark truths behind them. If you want to keep unpacking the history of the music that defined us, be sure to subscribe to our channel.